All right, here we are, chapter 16. This is Kinesiology 230. We're in presentation one, just the introduction and just some of the specificity of aerobic endurance training. So we've talked about resistance training. Now we're going more into the aerobic training. And the main takeaways or outcomes that we're looking for from this chapter include, the ability to design endurance training programs, principles of specificity. And what you'll find is as you read through this list, it'll be somewhat similar, right? In terms of we're talking the broad based in terms of program design, applying a stimulus, so trying to get a training response, etc. But it's different in terms of its application. We're not talking about muscular strength now. We're talking about the aerobic side of the equation. Things like target heart rate zones or metabolic equivalents are ways that we use to evaluate aerobic training, excuse me, and response to aerobic training as opposed to like reps and sets in strength training. But I will tell you, if you ask your clients to do particular activities like sprint 10 yards, and they do that, rest, do it again, rest, do it again, rest, and do it one more time for four of them, that's one set of four 10-yard sprints. So you can still have quantification in terms of aerobic training. It comes down to distance or perhaps speed in terms of how fast the person runs or does activity. All right. So in 2018, you had these physical activity guidelines that were provided by the Department of Health and Human Services. They recommended 150 to 300 minutes per week of moderate intensity physical activity or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity physical activity per week, if I can get it out. So they provide four main categories for this. It's like vigorous requires greater than 6.0 metabolic equivalents, which is, we'll talk about that in a bit. That's walking fast, running, manual labor. Moderate intensity, 3.0 to just under 6 METs, walking briskly, mopping, raking your yard. Light intensity, I guess you could mop vigorously or rake the yard vigorously. Then you have light intensity, 1.6 to just under 3 metabolic equivalents. Walking at a slow pace, cooking, light work while standing. I think they talk about checking at like a cashier, checking groceries. Physical activity requiring 1.0 to 1.5 is referred to as sedentary. That's kind of baseline. So when you look at the aerobic endurance training programs, you have to look at their present level of fitness, their exercise history and fitness goals. And we've talked about that a bunch, and it holds true here as well in terms of the aerobic side of the equation. And one of the more common goals is like fat loss. And when you look at talking about fat loss or weight loss, which are kind of synonymous, aerobic endurance training programs will elicit that response. And when you work with your clients, when you start having an aerobic response, you can think of it in terms of what happens with them going from the phosphagen system to glycolytic to the aerobic system and what happens in terms of the energy sources that are used for the aerobic system and how we get our ATP from beta oxidation, right? So it'll be different in terms of generalized fitness, and they note this here. When you have somebody who wants to compete in a 10K race or a marathon, you're going to have some more specific training. Believe me, there are mountains of places you can find to help clients understand and better understand how to do a 10K race or a marathon. And perhaps you're one of those people that just likes to go out and run a ton. But there are plenty of sources to help with this for sure. And I will tell you that when you work with clients, sometimes when they're in the phase of putting on miles, especially as they get into their longer, slower distance days, part of your responsibility as a trainer now is almost like to put them back together. You're not pounding on them as much as you were early on in their training, and you're kind of working with that person to work on prehab rehab type of modalities. Now, specifically, when you look at the chapter itself, we have these three main areas, one of which is specificity of aerobic endurance training. And that's found on page 426. And you have components of an aerobic endurance training program and then types of aerobic endurance training programs. So this is going to be pretty short in terms of content, but we're going to have like 5 or 6 presentations for this chapter. With specificity of aerobic endurance training. The principle of specificity states that the results of a training program will be directly related to training performed. So you know you're not going to have your clients do tons of power cleans or power clean it with heavy load with the intent of having aerobic endurance adaptation. So the book also notes that the specificity of the exercise being performed. You know, they make it very clear in terms of what we're talking about with a person working out, and the initial state, if you will, or stage of training can have a positive effect on cardiovascular adaptations. In terms of like a person works out and they do weights, they get a little bit tired, they're going to have a cardiovascular-like response, but because they're such in an early state or initial state of training and they're deconditioned, while it may feel like a cardiovascular adaptation, it's not a true cardiovascular response. They note that riding a bike and running are not the same in terms of muscle use and adaptation. And what they're really getting at here is in terms of a specificity. If you have somebody who wants to run a marathon and you want to then put them on a bike, realize that is not specific to that person's goal. If you said, we're going to do a bike as a way to do some cross training, as a way to kind of alleviate some of the pounding on your body from all the running that you're doing, that's different. But if you're saying I'm going to do a bike for cardio and have it be specific to running, it's not. So says the book, and I agree. Resistance training does not specifically increase maximal aerobic power, VO2 max, like we talked about. They'll get a cardio-like response the first time out, but it just is not the same. Despite the above, you know, you're going to have that effect, but you got to understand that the cardiovascular and resistance training are like this. One affects the other. If you have somebody who's trying to do heavy powerlifting and you ask them to run a 5K, those two things are not going to dovetail. You need to have your people trained in a way that's specific to what they're trying to accomplish. And more to the point, you know, they could have negative effects on one another. If you're trying to be extremely powerful and then you go out and run a 5K, that's going to have a deleterious effect on your training to be more explosive. So understand the continuum of knowing rep ranges and energy systems and how one can have a positive effect or a negative effect on the other has its place when we start talking endurance training as well as aerobic endurance training as well as resistance training.